A hand holds a piece of raw meat under the light of a window, and the question the man holding it is asking is not whether it tastes good. The question is whether the body that consumes it will pay a price the tongue cannot detect at the moment of eating. 14 centuries ago, a prohibition was placed on 8 categories of food. Not by a nutritionist, not by a laboratory, but by a revelation that named them harmful before the instruments to measure that harm had been placed on any table anywhere in the world. A physician in the 7th century had no microscope, no toxicology panel, no pathology report. And yet what was declared forbidden in that century maps onto what modern food science has since confirmed with equipment that took the rest of the world another 1,000 years to build. The first promise in this video, there is a substance in this list, poured into a glass, consumed at every table in the world, that Allah prohibited in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 90, in the year 632, and that the International Agency for Research on Cancer did not classify as a Group 1 carcinogen until 1988, 13 centuries later. The second promise. There is a flesh in this list whose prohibition appears in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 173, and whose most dangerous parasite, invisible to the naked eye, was not discovered by Western science until 1835, 1,200 years after the prohibition was already in place. Stay until the fourth item in this list. Both promises arrive there. And what you find on that table will change the way you look at every word of prohibition ever written in the Quran about what enters the body. A bowl of dark liquid sits on a stone surface, and what it contains, shed blood, is the first thing Allah names alongside carrion and pork in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 3. Forbidden to you is carrion, blood, the flesh of swine, and that which has been dedicated to other than Allah. The prohibition of blood as food is stated 4 times in the Quran: Al-Baqarah 2:173, Al-Ma'idah 5:3, Al-An'am 6:145, Al-Nahl 16:115, and in each instance it is listed alongside the same group of prohibitions, a repetition that classical scholars read as emphasis, and that modern food microbiology reads as necessity. A researcher places a sample of fresh blood into a culture medium under laboratory conditions and records how quickly bacterial colonies appear. And what she observes is that blood is not merely a food for the human body, but an ideal growth medium for the bacteria most responsible for foodborne illness. In 2019 review, in Comprehensive Reviews in Food Science and Food Safety, found that blood-based food products carry elevated risks of contamination from Salmonella, Campylobacter, and Yersinia, organisms that proliferate rapidly in blood's nutrient-dense environment, with researchers recommending strict processing protocols that are impossible to standardize in traditional consumption settings. But here is what almost no one mentions about the prohibition of blood. It also removes from the body what the slaughter process is designed to drain, a finding that matters because blood retained in meat carries heavy metals, uric acid, and metabolic waste products that the animal's body had not yet cleared at the moment of death, and that proper drainage during halal slaughter significantly reduces in the final product. And the food that comes next in this list is the one Allah places first in the same verse. The Maita, the animal found already dead. And what a food scientist finds when she tests the tissue of an animal that died without proper slaughter is not what the flesh of a properly processed animal contains. A hand lifts a cloth from an animal carcass lying in a field under the afternoon sun. And in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 173, Allah says, He has only forbidden to you dead animals, maita, blood, the flesh of swine, and that which has been dedicated to other than Allah. What makes carrion dangerous is not the animal itself, but the speed at which decomposition transforms its tissue. Clostridium botulinum, Salmonella, and Campylobacter proliferate within hours of natural death in warm conditions, converting protein the body could have used into endotoxins the body must now fight. A food safety researcher places a sample of tissue from an animal that died without slaughter alongside a sample from a properly processed animal, and measures bacterial load at the same time intervals. And the difference in the numbers she records explains why the prohibition did not require a laboratory to justify it. Only a civilization that had observed what happened to the people who ignored it. But here is what almost no one mentions about the prohibition of carrion. The danger is not limited to bacterial contamination, An animal that dies of disease carries that disease in its tissue, and consuming it transfers the pathogen directly, a transmission route that the WHO identifies today as one of the primary mechanisms of zoonotic disease spread from animal populations to human ones. And the glass that comes next in this list holds the first promise we made at the opening. The substance Allah prohibited in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 90, 14 centuries ago, and that the world's leading cancer research body classified as a Group 1 carcinogen in 1988, with no safe level of consumption identified in any subsequent study. A man holds a glass of wine up to the light, and Allah says in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verses 90 and 91, "O you who believe, indeed intoxicants, gambling, sacrificing on stone altars, and divining arrows are but defilement from the work of Satan. So avoid it that you may be successful." The International Agency for Research on Cancer classified alcohol as a Group 1 carcinogen in 1988. The highest classification, reserved for substances with sufficient evidence of causing cancer in humans, and subsequent research linked it to cancers of the mouth, throat, esophagus, liver, colon, and breast, with no threshold below which risk disappears. A woman places a glass of water on a wooden table and sets aside what was in it before. And the mechanism behind alcohol's carcinogenicity is acetaldehyde, the compound the liver produces when it metabolizes ethanol, a substance so toxic that the body treats its breakdown as an emergency, diverting resources from every other repair process while it does so. But here is what almost no one mentions about the prohibition of alcohol. A 2018 study in The Lancet, analyzing data from 195 countries and 28 million individuals, concluded that the safest level of alcohol consumption is 0, not one drink, not occasional drinking. 0, which is the threshold the Quran established in the 7th century as the only acceptable amount. And the flesh that comes next is the second promise, the one whose prohibition appears in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 173, and whose most dangerous parasite was not identified by Western science until 1835, 1200 years after the verse was already being recited in the Arabian Peninsula. A butcher places a cut of pork on a wooden surface under the light, and Allah says in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 173, "He has only forbidden to you dead animals, blood, the flesh of swine, lam al-khinzir, and that which has been dedicated to other than Allah." In 1835, a British scientist named James Paget identified a parasite coiled inside human muscle tissue during a post-mortem examination, Trichinella spiralis, and traced its origin to undercooked pork, identifying for the first time in Western science the mechanism behind a disease that had been killing people for centuries, without anyone understanding where it came from. A researcher places a slide of pork muscle tissue under a microscope lens and locates the cyst, the coiled larva of Trichinella spiralis encapsulated inside the fiber. And what she is looking at was prohibited in the Quran 12 centuries before the microscope existed to find it. But here is what almost no one mentions about the prohibition of pork. Trichinella is not the only concern. Pigs are primary hosts for the hepatitis E virus, Yersinia enterocolitica, and multiple strains of influenza that cross directly to humans, making them what virologists call a mixing vessel, a biological interface between animal and human disease pools that the Quran removed from the human diet before the concept of a virus had a name in any language. And the rule that comes next was described not in the Quran itself, but in an authenticated hadith, a prohibition on a category of animals whose position in the food chain gives them a property that food safety researchers did not have a word for until the 20th century. A hunter holds the carcass of a predatory animal by the feet in a forest, and the Prophet said, "Every predatory animal with a fang is forbidden to eat." Narrated in Sahih Muslim, Hadith 1934, and authenticated also in Sahih al-Bukhari through parallel narrations. Predatory animals sit at the top of their food chains. They eat herbivores that eat plants, concentrating in their tissue every contaminant that exists at every level below them. A process food scientists call biomagnification, the accumulation of persistent organic pollutants, mercury, dioxins, and PCBs at levels that multiply with each link of the chain. A researcher measures mercury concentration in the liver of a large predatory animal, and records a number 20 times higher than the herbivore it consumed. And what she is measuring is the same property that the Prophet described as the reason for the prohibition, not in the language of chemistry, but in the language of observation. The fang marks the predator, and the predator accumulates what its prey could not expel. But here is what almost no one mentions about the prohibition of predatory animals. Persistent organic pollutants, like PCBs and dioxins, do not break down in the body. They accumulate in fat tissue and remain for decades, increasing in concentration with every predatory meal consumed, which is why the WHO identifies apex predators as the primary dietary source of these compounds in human populations globally. And the rule that comes next concerns not what animal is eaten, but how it is killed. A distinction that appears in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 3, as a list of methods of death that render an animal forbidden, and that a food scientist measuring stress hormones in muscle tissue would recognize as a list of the conditions most likely to contaminate meat at the cellular level. A knife is placed on a wooden surface beside a vessel, and Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 3, specifies the animals forbidden by cause of death. That which has been strangled, that beaten to death, that which has fallen from a height, that gored by horns, and that partially eaten by a wild animal. Each a method that does not allow the body's blood to drain. An animal that dies by strangling, blunt force, or falling undergoes a surge of cortisol and adrenaline in its final moments, stress hormones released into the bloodstream and absorbed into the muscle tissue. And a 2014 study in Meat Science found that these elevated stress hormones measurably increase the rate of bacterial spoilage in the resulting meat by altering its pH, creating conditions that accelerate pathogen growth. A food technologist measures the pH of muscle tissue from an animal that died by blunt force alongside tissue from a properly slaughtered animal. And the difference in acidity she records explains why the Islamic method of slaughter, sharp blade, swift cut, complete blood drainage, minimal stress, produces a biochemical environment hostile to the bacteria that cause foodborne illness. But here is what almost no one mentions about the prohibition of improper slaughter. Halal slaughter requires that blood be drained completely from the carcass, and blood retained in improperly killed animals is the same nutrient-rich medium that a 2019 food safety review identified as the primary bacterial growth environment in contaminated meat. Meaning the method of slaughter is itself a food safety protocol 14 centuries before food safety was a scientific discipline. And the rule that comes next extends the prohibition beyond the specific to the general, covering every intoxicating substance in any quantity, written not as a cultural preference but as a medical boundary, and confirmed by neuroscience in the 21st century in terms that a 7th century physician had no vocabulary to anticipate. A glass sits empty on a stone table, and the Prophet said, "Every intoxicant is khamr, and every khamr is forbidden." Narrated in Sahih Muslim, hadith 2003, a statement that extended the prohibition from wine alone to every substance that produces intoxication, regardless of its source or form. The Prophet also said, "Whatever intoxicates in large amounts, a small amount of it is also forbidden." Narrated in Abu Dawud, hadith 3681, and in Tirmidhi, hadith 1865, establishing that the threshold for prohibition is not the experience of intoxication, but the property of producing it. Removing dose as a defense. A neuroscientist places an imaging scan of a brain on a light board and marks the regions showing reduced activity under the influence of a substance. And what she is mapping is what the Prophet described as the removal of AQL, reason, the faculty he identified as the target of intoxication, damaged by every substance that reaches the brain and alters its function, regardless of the quantity consumed. But here is what almost no one mentions about the general prohibition on intoxicants. A 2020 report by the Global Drug Policy Commission reviewed evidence across all intoxicating substances and found that no psychoactive compound that crosses the blood-brain barrier is without measurable neurological consequence at any dose, confirming that the Prophet's prohibition on quantity had a neurobiological basis that brain imaging technology only made visible in the 21st century. And the last category in this list is the broadest, the khaba'ith, the harmful and filthy things. And a hand placed on Surah Al-A'raf, verse 157, finds Allah saying, He makes lawful the good things and prohibits the khaba'ith, a principle that does not require a list of every item, but a standard applied to every new one science finds. A hand pushes away a plate on a wooden table, and Allah says in Surah Al-A'raf, verse 157, that the Prophet makes lawful for them the good things, al-tayyibat, and forbids for them the evil, the harmful, the filthy, al-khaba'ith, a distinction that does not require a list of every item, but a principle applied to every new one. Rats, mice, and insects, the organisms classical scholars most consistently identify under khaba'ith, are the primary reservoir hosts of the diseases the WHO tracks under zoonotic surveillance: plague, hantavirus, leptospirosis, and toxoplasmosis, each transmitted to humans through direct consumption or contact, each preventable by a prohibition that did not name the pathogen but named the carrier. A researcher in a disease surveillance laboratory places pins on a map tracing the global distribution of rodent-borne illness outbreaks, and the pattern her hands are drawing is the epidemiological argument for a prohibition that was written 14 centuries before epidemiology had a name. But here is what almost no one mentions about the prohibition on khaba'ith. The principle is not a closed list. It is a living standard, extending to every organism and substance that science subsequently identifies as harmful, which means the Quranic category of al-khaba'ith is not a historical inventory, but a framework whose boundaries expand with every new finding placed on a laboratory table. A pair of hands rests open on a wooden table in the last light of the day, and what is on that table is the absence of 8 things: blood, carrion, alcohol, pork, predatory animals, improperly slaughtered meat, intoxicants of every kind, and the harmful things that have no clean name. Every one of them removed from the table by a prohibition that existed before the laboratory existed to explain it. The distance between what was declared forbidden in the 7th century and what food science, toxicology, and epidemiology confirm today with equipment that fills entire buildings, that distance, across each of these 8 categories, turns out to be a distance of time rather than knowledge. And the instruments were always catching up to the table. A single empty bowl rests on a stone surface in the afternoon light, and whoever looks at it now no longer looks at what it does not contain as an absence. They look at it as a decision made 14 centuries ago by something that already knew what the laboratory would eventually find.